Shalom and best wishes for a Shabbat Shalom. I'd like to share with you a thought from this week's Parsha, the second of the two Parshiot we're going to read this week, Behar Bechukotai. This is an insight that I learned from Rabbi Shlomo Yosef Zevin. He's a fascinating character with an incredible literary output. He's probably best known as being the founder and the editor for many, many years of Encyclopedia Talmudit, which is a massive work that goes through every area of halacha and provides an in-depth analysis of them. But he also has a beautiful sefer that includes really touching insights into the Parsha, and that's what I'd like to share with you today. Rabbi Zevin notes that when it comes to the way a Jewish person lives, we're really obligated to walk in two directions. What he calls milamata lemala, from below to above, and milamala lemata, and from above to below. So what does he mean? He suggests that when we go from lemata lemala, from below to above, that's referring to our own spiritual growth, our Torah study, our tefillah, the ways we try to improve ourselves. And he notes that that's really an endless process. For the rest of our lives, we're going to be doing that. There's never a never-ending amount of Torah. There's a never-ending amount of chidushim, of new approaches and appreciations to Torah. This is what I think Pirkei Avot meant when it says, hafoch ba v'hafoch ba dekula ba. We have to keep turning the Torah over and over and looking at it from many different directions, because everything's in it. We're going to find so much meaning and so much inspiration in the Torah. That's what it means to move from below to above, from here into the Beit Midrash, where we look after our own spiritual well-being. Now, moving from above to below is not, as it may sound, at least according to Rav Zevin, something negative. Rather, it means applying the Torah that we studied above in the Beit Midrash to our life and our relationships here below, here on earth. So moving upwards refers to our relationship with the Torah as a way to get close to God, and moving from above to below refers to our relationship with the Torah as our way to impact humanity. One of the grand ideas that Rabbi Soloveitchik taught was our obligation to imitate God. And the Talmud speaks of our obligation to mimic God's ways by visiting the sick and clothing the naked and burying the dead. But Rabbi Zevin notes that there's something else that we could mimic about God. There's a beautiful midrash that says, B'sha'ah shebara hakadosh baruch hu ha'olam, when God created the world, hitaveh sheyeh lo dira b'tachtonim. It's amazing. God desired to have a place to live below, amongst humanity. Kishem sheyesh lo be'elyonim, just as God has a place above. God is wanting, his regular home and his summer home. And perhaps this idea of God wanting to dwell here below means that God wanted to have a very first-hand influence on humanity. In fact, the end of the Midrash seems to support this idea, because the end of the Midrash records that when God saw that Adam and Chava sinned, he left. He went back up to the heavens, perhaps realizing that his influence down here wasn't what he thought it would be. So God wants to have a dira b'tachtonim. He wants to have an influence here. And so if that's what God wants, we have to mimic God in that realm as well. We have to also desire a dira b'tachtonim, an opportunity, a responsibility to have an effect on those below. So on those amongst us. And what this amounts to is that our upward movements, going from here above, our Torah study, our personal growth, is in service to humanity. And on this point, Rabbi Zevin quotes another beautiful midrash, this one about King David. And it's a midrash that aims to understand the beginning of Parshat Bechukotai. Im Bechukotai telechu, if you walk in my statutes. Hadahu dichtiv, this is what it means in Tehillim. Chishavti dirachai va'ashiva raglai el eidotecha, which means I considered my ways and I returned to your testimonies. And this is what David HaMelech said. Amar David, Ribono shel Olam, Master of the universe, B'chol yom vayom hayiti mechashev v'omer l'makom ploni u'lebeit dira plonit ani holech. All day I said I'm going to go to place X or to the home of Y. V'hayu raglai miviot livatei knesiot u'livatei midrashot. But my feet would bring me to the synagogues and to the house of study. So Rab Zevin does something so beautiful with this. He says that what David is saying here is that his desire was to go to different places, to help people. And he was also always called to the Beit Midrash. And this is what it means to live a life where we go limala limata, from here above, always working on our Torah study and our tefillah, and limala limata, recognizing that we have to apply what we've learned in the Beit Midrash to our life. And that's what im bichukotai telechu means. Walking in God's statutes means the ability to walk in two directions at the same time, from below to above and from above to below. To strive to excel in our personal religious growth and to put our Torah into action here. Rabbi Soloveitchik has a beautiful, beautiful description of his grandfather, Rav Chaim Brisker. He says in Rav Chaim's house, one could not find the Chovot HaLevavot or Mesilat Yesharim, the classic works of Musar that help us develop our character. What he had there was a Shas, a Talmud, a copy of the Rambam, Maimonides' Code, and the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law. That's all. Yet, says Rabbi Soloveitchik, there was no greater Baal Chesed than Rav Chaim Brisker. He had ordered that no attributes be inscribed on his tombstone, but my father and my uncle insisted that one attribute be mentioned. Not Gaon, not Talmudic genius, but Rav Chesed, a rabbi of kindness. Rav Chaim ben Rav Yosef Dov Halevi, Rav Chesed, is what it says on his tombstone. And continues Rabbi Soloveitchik, in my opinion, his Chesed personality towered above his intellectual personality. Rabbi Soloveitchik saw his grandfather as a man who could walk in both directions, mastering all aspects of Torah and walking in God's statutes by doing acts of chesed for his community. I'll close with one of my favorite stories, and maybe you've heard it before. It's a story that Rav Yehuda Amital, founder of Yeshivat Har Etzion, was fond of telling, and a story that he considered to be telling of the founding principle, the foundational idea of his yeshiva. And it's a story about the founder of Chabad Chassidut, Rav Shner Zalman of Liadi. And the story goes that he was in the end of a railroad flat. 2 rooms away, there was a baby sleeping. And in the middle room was his grandson. And his grandson was studying Torah. Suddenly, the Baal HaTanya hears the baby crying. So the elder Rebbe rose from his studies, passed through the room where his grandson was studying, and went to the next room to soothe the baby back to sleep. Meanwhile, his grandson was too involved in his studies to notice the baby was crying. On returning to his room, the Baal HaTanya told his grandson to stop learning. And he said to him, listen, if someone is studying Torah and fails to hear a baby's cry, there is something wrong with his learning. This is a story about another man who knew what it meant to walk in 2 directions at the same time. What an inspiring model of what it means to live a life devoted to God, devoted to Torah, and devoted to humanity. Im bichukotai telechu. If you walk in my statutes, like David HaMelech did, always seeking to check on someone in their home and always seeking to go back to the Beit Midrash. This is what it means to live walking in 2 directions. Yehi Ratzon, may it be God's will and our will that we can do that as well. Shabbat Shalom.